we're 10 years into the Trump era, right? So that's a long time. And what has been cultivated is this idea of the kind of use of good and evil that we see being used a lot by authoritarians, right? And what I've called a politics of disgust. And so you paint the other side, right, as literally instruments of the devil. And so what then becomes a kind of, it's not a choice between like who's better or worse. The way they frame the choice is it's Trump or evil, right? The Democrats are evil, and the kind of worst kinds of things. So why do we hear things like um, uh, they're eating the dogs and the cats, right? Right in Springfield, Ohio, right? We hear that because it disgusts people, right? It brings up these visceral emotions of like, and it makes people think, oh, well, somebody who does that isn't even human.
Well, we have the election behind us, and many of us are pawing through the returns and reflecting on what just happened. And once again, we're confronted with a phenomenon that is both universal insofar as Western democracies have not liked their incumbents, but also entirely unique to America. And that is the predominance of white Christian nationalists in one political party who have come to dominate our politics and who espouse a philosophy that's frankly contrary to the founding fathers' view that it's not a country defined by race or religion, but by the ideal. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator, and so on. But that's not how millions and millions of people look at it. And Trump once more owes his victory entirely, and I will say this entirely, to the votes of white Christian nationalists, people who, frankly, overwhelmingly favor strong leaders. They want someone to be the victor against evil. They want someone to crush their enemies. They want someone to impose their Christian values on the rest of us. And they take a dim view, frankly, of the last 50 or 60 years of progress for women, minorities, anyone who isn't a white male. And they have once again successfully elected a president. So, what is it about America that gets them so mad? And you may notice that even after the election, these people are still mad. Didn't they just win? Aren't they happy? Don't they want to celebrate? They still seem awfully angry. And anger, I think, is a big part of it. And I think we also have to come to terms with the fact they live in a different media universe than the rest of us and consume news differently, get a different slice of reality, or non-reality rather, than the rest of us. And that creates a very difficult problem in a democracy in which you rely on people to have a certain amount of decent public virtue, concern about their fellow citizens, concern about the goodness and the decency of their country. And you expect them to have a modicum of information on which to base their votes. And when you don't, you find yourself in a pretty bad spot. And that's where we are. We have a substantial, they're not a majority, but a substantial number of Americans who, frankly, have affirmatively embraced fascism. And they call themselves Christian. Yeah. How do we make sense of this? What do we do with that information? Is this unmovable? Do we need a religious revolution? Do we need a communications revolution? How do we address this fundamental attack on the essence of America, which is a pluralistic democracy? Well, I have the perfect person. He's been a guest on this show before, and he just wrote a tremendous piece for Time Magazine, which we will link in the show notes. Robert P. Jones. He is CEO of PRRI. Those are the people who do the American Values Surveys every year, asking tens of thousands of Americans about their views on American culture and politics. And he has been studying the connection of race and religion for decades now. There is no one smarter on this subject, no one who I have learned more from than Robbie Jones. So without further ado, Robbie, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks, Jen. Happy to be here.
I wish it were happier circumstances.
Indeed.
We had an election, and as I said in the introduction, once again, a non-majority of the American people played a really disproportionate role in the outcome. And that, of course, are the people that you write about, study about, talk about a lot, and that's white Christian nationalists. Let's start with just some basic data points. Did they behave any differently in this election than they did in 2020 or, frankly, 2016?
Yeah, or 1980.
Yes.
We could go back a little further. Really what we saw is remarkable stability in the votes of white Christian voters. And kind of as a sociologist, we typically divide up the white Christian vote into subgroups. And even when we look at more specific groups, we saw virtually no movement. So just give you the lay of the land. We're working from exit poll data, which, as you know, isn't the most accurate, but it's the best picture we've got at this point of how people voted. And so what we saw is that white evangelical Protestant Christians, the group that is Trump's staunchest base and has been ever since he entered the political arena back in 2015, have given him once again about 80% of their vote. So about 8 in 10 white evangelicals, every time he has been on the ballot, that has been where they have been. That's probably the number that people know the most, the people are most familiar with. I think what I always get surprises from is when I remind people that, but the other two groups of white Christians also voted majority for Trump. So even the non-evangelical white Protestants, so what we used to call the mainline Protestant groups, think, Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopalians, that group voted about 6 in 10 for Trump as well. That's right on the money where they've also been every time Trump's been on the ballot. And white Catholics, also about 6 in 10 support for Trump. So if you take all white Christians together, so it's 8 in 10 white evangelicals, 6 in 10 white non-evangelical Protestants, 6 in 10 white Catholics. You put them all together, though, it's 2/3 of all white Christians, voting for Trump. And we, in this election, what I would say is like not seeing any movement, knowing what we know about this particular candidate is itself fairly astonishing.
And we're going to get to that because, of course, they voted for him either despite certain traits or because of certain traits. And I do want to get into that. Let me talk briefly, though, about another aligned group, and that is Hispanics or self-identified Hispanics who may also be evangelicals. Now, when we talk Hispanics, we have to remember there's a wide variation. We're not necessarily talking about first generation or even second generation people. We're not necessarily talking about people who even speak Spanish. They simply have a Spanish surname or Spanish ancestry that they self-identify. What about those voters? How did they vote, and have they changed over time?
Well, we did see some movement, anybody who's been paying attention to the news knows that, we did see some movement among Latinos overall. And what we know about that is that it does seem to be overwhelmingly linked to economic concerns that we saw we saw in pre-election polling, we saw in the exit polls, deep concerns about the current economic situation, feeling pinched, and largely, I think, around, even though inflation, has decreased, the prices that went up have not, come back down with inflation. I think that was at the heart of it. And we see that kind of bleed over and reflected in the religious makeup. What's notable, though, is that we've always seen this big gap between Latino Protestants and Latino Catholics. So there's a big religious divide in the Latino community. In fact, that religious divide is quite large. And if you really want to understand Latino voters, you can't understand them without understanding religious affiliation. And so what we saw there is typically what we see is that Latino Protestants are the most conservative voters, and they lean Republican. And again, consistently in elections, we have seen them show up and vote. About 6 in 10 voted for Trump in previous elections, and it looks like They came in a little bit above that number in this current election. And then Latino Catholics actually tend to lean Democratic. What's interesting here is that we actually have some discrepancies in the exit polls on this number. The Edison National Election Pool actually shows that for the first time ever that Latino Catholics voted majority for Trump, but that's really different than the AP VoteCast exit poll shows, which shows them only voting about 40% for Trump. So it's about a 10 to 12 point difference between those two exit polls. All of our pre-election polling actually shows that the AP VoteCast one is probably more correct, that it's more like a 40% Trump, 60% Harris among Latino Catholics there. But even that is an uptick. So again, we just see this kind of uptick across both groups of Latino, both Protestant and Catholics in this election.
I'm not sure there's a knowable answer to this, but do Protestant Catholics identify more as white Americans? In other words, these are not the people who necessarily came from Catholic countries, Spanish-speaking countries, a generation or a half generation ago. They may have been in the United States. Now, there have been evangelical movements in Spanish-speaking countries, but many of these people may not have been evangelical if you go back in their family history a generation or so. Is there kind of a social or political difference in outlook between Catholic Latinos and non-Catholic Latinos?
There is, and we've just been talking about Latino Catholics and Latino Protestants, but there's also a third group, and that is the Latinos who have left churches altogether, right, and have become religiously unaffiliated. And so what we tend to see just at the macro level is that if we're talking about kind of immigration and first-generation immigrants, they tend to be more Catholic, largely from Mexico and in the U.S., and tend to identify as Catholic. As second and third and kind of further generation immigrants go, it turns out that as time they become less Catholic, so the kind of second generation is less Catholic, the third generation is even less Catholic, but actually they're going in two different directions, right? So they are less Catholic, but they are more Protestant, but they're also more unaffiliated at the same time. And that other group doesn't get talked about that much. And what tends to happen is that the Protestant group becomes more politically conservative and more reliably Republican. And that's largely because they are evangelical in their orientation and are kind of connected to that white evangelical theological and cultural world. And it kind of pulls them, I think, to the right in American politics. But the ones that become unaffiliated actually are more likely to be Democrat. So the needle doesn't move a lot in terms, because what happens is you've got Catholics that tend to be about 60% Democrat, unaffiliated who tend to be even more Democrat, but then the Protestants who tend to be more Republican. So the kind of needle doesn't actually move over through the kind of generations. We're talking about immigrants here. And of course, it's worth noting that there are many people here who are Latino, self-identify as Latino, have been here for like 6 generations, right? And so that, that's a different scenario altogether. But the big takeaway is that those Latino Protestants have really, they're very tightly connected to white evangelical theology there. We don't actually see a lot of difference between white identity between Latino Protestants and Catholics. That's kind of interesting. But it is worth noting that in our data, for example, it's about 8 in 10 Latinos who also identify as white.
Interesting.
And so that's a really, kind of notable complexity about kind of racial and ethnic identity among Latinos.
Now, before we go into the reasons why they are so wedded to Donald Trump and the Republican Party, let me ask a little bit about gender. Was there any shift within the white evangelical community or within white Christians more generally based upon gender? We had a woman candidate who was not running on her gender, but choice was a very big issue. And the sort of misogyny and outward contempt that Trump often demonstrates towards women was certainly part of that campaign. How did that break out when you look at the gender divide?
Yeah, well, we're still operating with very limited data, like from the exit polls here. One thing I can say just in general, though, is that, there's a lot of talk about the gender gap leading into the election, gender gap, and particularly among certain groups, like, so the gender gap among Latinos, the gender gap among African Americans, gender gap among Gen Z there. And what we have found, like, looking at least the preliminary numbers that we have, is that those gender gaps are there, but they turn to be much less pronounced in the final data than some people were looking at. And it actually closed. Christopher Parker, who's a academic who teaches at UC Santa Barbara, one of the kind of leading experts on African American data, actually did one of the best studies where he actually had panel data, where he looked at the same people over time. So not just cross sections of the electorate, but the same people throughout 2024. And he did a big study of Black voters. And what he found basically is that the gender gap actually closed among African Americans as we got closer to the election, and and the choice became starker. It closed. It turned out to not abortion. I think turned out to not to be the driver that many people thought, both in terms of driving a gender gap and in terms of driving turnout. It turned out not to quite be the most powerful driver that people were thinking it would be. Certainly compared to 2022, it was less, I think, powerful.
What was interesting is that many states that voted for Trump also voted on abortion measures that protected choice. So somehow voters have figured out, oh, I can protect reproductive freedom and still vote for my guy, which was not exactly what Democrats had in mind. Good for the pro-choice movement, but not really the motivating factor that Democrats hoped it would be in the election. So let's talk about the rationale. Why is it that people who describe themselves as Christian, who talk about being born again, who have some connection with a great theological tradition, would embrace someone who was so openly, really unabashedly fascist in his outlook? And I don't mean this simply in a political sense. I mean this in the terms of denigrating weak people, making fun of the disabled, slurring people from Puerto Rico. The entire sort of affect is so anti-Christian that it creates a question in many people's mind. What do they see in him? Why are they so emotionally attached to him? What have you been able to figure out about this?
Well, Jen, I'm just thinking about how many buckets of ink you and I have spent trying to answer this question.
Yes, past, I know.
10 years.
Yes.
10 years now we've been wrestling with this question, and it's still a mind-boggling question. I think that's why it keeps getting asked, right? And I think it's mind-boggling if you take at face value the claims of white evangelical Christians. So you and I are both old enough to remember the term values voters, right? Back in 2004, there was, we were talking about exit polls in 2004 after George W. Bush's win, and when Ralph Reed and other members of the Christian right were crowing that values voters and moral values were the thing that turned that election, and that it was white evangelicals leading the charge. And in fact, if you go back and remember that election, there was a lot, there was, millions of dollars spent on branding themselves as values voters. There were like ivotevalues.com and ivotevalues.org, and these like big semi trucks with I Vote Values driving all over the South, registering people to vote. So it was a big, and, it's remarkable to me that like, we're not hearing much about values voters in this current election cycle, nor did we, as soon as Trump came for the scene. And, I'll still cite one of the numbers that I think is just the biggest insight here that you can see in the data, is that, back in 2011, we asked this question about, morals in a candidate. And the question was, do you think that an elected official who's committed an immoral act in their private life can nonetheless behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life? And when we asked this question in 2011, white evangelicals, the values voters, only 3 in 10 said, yes, that's possible, right? 2/3 of them disagreed. They said, no, there's a direct connection between candidate character and their ability to fulfill their duties in office. We asked this question again in 2016. You and I have talked about this before, and you can guess where this is going. With Trump at the top of the ticket, it went from 3 in 10 to 7 in 10 saying, yes, this was possible. And so I think we have an insight there that what essentially happened was, on the face of it, white evangelicals were claiming to have a political ethic based on principle, right? And character. Like that was the kind of political ethic they had. When Trump got to the top of the ticket, became the Republican nominee, the power partisanship really among white evangelicals completely eroded that, and they just willy-nilly exchanged the political ethic of principle for a political ethic of expediency and power. I mean, that's really as baldly as you can put it from the evidence. And then they spent a lot of time trying to square the circle. Like you would hear people saying, "Oh, well, Trump's a baby Christian; he just hasn't matured yet." Like all these ridiculous, explanations to try to make Trump one of them. And Trump was even trying to play the part, really. And what ended up happening is it just became very clear that this was a very quid pro quo, the kind of deal that Trump loves to make, a very quid pro quo thing on Trump's end, and white evangelicals were more than willing to sign up for that. So what did they get out of it? They get promises of power and explicit ones. If you hear Trump. When he addressed the National Religious Broadcasters meeting back in March, where he knew he had a kind of auditorium full of white evangelical Protestants, he was talking about, my Christians and using our religion and like those kinds of language. But he was also saying, look, I know you're in decline. I know your numbers are declining. I know your power is declining. But if you elect me, and again, you'll only have to do this one more time. If you elect me, I will restore your power. And I will I'll bring it back. I'll bring back the churchgoer. I'll bring back the power of Christian churches. And he just made that quite explicit. And that was, a kind of Faustian bargain that white evangelicals have been more than willing to make.
I'm interested in how much of the bargain is the white part and how much is the Christian part. Now, certainly, you look at our Supreme Court, frankly, or you look at Trump, and there's a lot about, frankly, reestablishing Christianity as the basis for governing. You have a Speaker of the House who talks about the Bible, not the Constitution, as his guidebook. You have people who are buying Bibles for classrooms. So you have this sense of religious establishment overtly making the country a Christian country. But you also have something else going on here, which is the white part. And Trump, if nothing else, has been utterly consistent on the white part. He's kind of waxed and waned when it comes to abortion. He'll kind of say whatever he needs to say to kind of get through the election. I don't know that his heart has ever been in really going after LGBTQ people. He was once very pro gay rights. But when it comes to whiteness, that seems to be his core appeal. And if there is a core to Trump, something that he fundamentally believes. So when it's immigration, when it's people coming in to kill your kids, whether it's even Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, but is not majority white, that seems to have a far bigger punch than the Christian part of things. Is that right? Or is there a combination of it? Or does it work differently for different groups of white Christians?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the claim to power in this country has always been more than a religious claim. It's always been more than an ethnic or racial claim. It's been both. We even have a kind of acronym for it: White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, WASP, right? And you could, even as late as like the middle of the 20th century, the historian David Hollenbach, said, look, if you were in charge of something big and important as late as the middle of the 20th century, the chances are you were white, you were Anglo-Saxon, and you were Protestant in your kind of background. And that sense of like who the country is for, right, was deep, deep, deep in the DNA. And so if you think about the KKK, I always use, this is like the kind of eye-opening example. People tend to think of the KKK as an anti-Black terrorist organization. And of course, that is true. But what we forget so easily is that the KKK was also anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish.
Exactly.
Now, what makes sense of an organization that's anti-Black, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish? And Catholic, of course, is Christian, right? Well, the thing that makes it sense is that the kind of what they were protecting and the power that they were protecting was for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians. And that claim to dominance and like that's who the country is of, by, and for is deep, deep in the country's DNA. And I think that's what Trump is really tapping, is that kind of sense of entitlement, dominion. And, we talk a lot about white Christian nationalism. And when I usually talk about this, I do use the word white in front of the word Christian nationalism, because it is that melding of the two where the real power is in the country. And, just to kind of put a fine point on it here, when we measure support for Christian nationalism, and these aren't kind of sloppy measures. I mean, these are things like U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. If you're not truly Christian, you can't be truly American. The U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, like those kinds of statements. It's 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants, right, who qualify as Christian nationalists using those kinds of hard measures. And when we look at things like immigration, anti-Muslim attitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes, all that, white identity boost, even those who are Christian nationalists, white identity will boost their anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant attitudes by about 10 points. So the whiteness, right, actually does some work in addition to, they're tied together, but the whiteness actually does quite significant work, in that Christian nationalist space.
Now, when you confront or discuss, however you want to put it, many of these Trump voters, and you say things like, well, he's going to deport people who have been here virtually their entire lives, or you tell them that he has said he wants to, deport legal immigrants, or he wants to make America a Christian country, or whatever other thing he has said, or you repeat some of his slurs against Jews, against Puerto Ricans, they will very often say, that's not true, or a variation, he's just saying that. Do they believe that, or is that a very conscious excuse? In other words, what view of Trump are they consuming? How do they get their information about Trump, and what do they believe in their heart of hearts about him?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. It's obviously complex, but I think one thing's going on is a kind of third thing, and that is that they have so, and this has been, all, like, again, we're 10 years into the Trump era, right? So that's a long time. And what has been cultivated is this idea of the kind of use of good and evil that we see being used a lot by authoritarians, right? And what I've called a politics of disgust. And so you paint the other side, right, as literally instruments of the devil. And so what then becomes a kind of, it's not a choice between like who's better or worse. The way they frame the choice is it's Trump or evil, right? The Democrats are evil. And the kind of worst kinds of things. So why do we hear things like they're eating the dogs and the cats, right?
Right.
In Springfield, Ohio, right? We hear that because it disgusts people, right? It brings up these visceral emotions of like, and it makes people think, oh, well, somebody who does that isn't even human, right? Or is under the control of some kind of radical evil. And the kind of most extreme things, I think, were part of kind of, it's not even a choice, right? So you can be complicit in evil or you can vote for Trump, right? Is the way that this often gets framed. It has been being framed for a decade. I think the other piece is that the echo chambers, right, are what you get from Fox News, what you get from Newsmax, what you get from One American News, Truth Social, Telegraph, like that world. You will never hear those outrageous things that Trump is saying in that world, right? It's much more calibrated there. And I think also there's just a sense too that, maybe Trump is just saying these things to own the libs, right? Just to kind of rile people up. He doesn't really mean it. And I'll say this too, that when we have tested, and this is the disturbing part, I think, is that when we have tested and asked people about even some of the extreme stuff that he has said and given them an opportunity to respond to it, we get alarming numbers of agreement. And I'll just give you one here. And this goes in the category of things I never thought as a social scientist I would ever have to ask as a question on a public opinion survey. But because it's now in the water, we asked a question that said, do you agree or disagree that immigrants entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country.
Right.
And again, I never thought I'd have to ask that question. It's a serious thing we needed to know about our fellow Americans, but it is. And it turns out that 6 in 10 Republicans agreed with Trump about that. And when we look at the religious landscape, it is 6 in 10 white evangelicals as well, who are like with him, right? And just kind of, make sure we all understand, this is language straight out of Mein Kampf. Like, this is Nazi language, right? This is not just kind of conservative or hateful. Like, it's Nazi.
Yes,
language.
It is.
And we have 6 in 10 Republicans and 6 in 10 white evangelical Protestants saying, yeah, I'm down with that idea. I believe that.
One of the reasons, and this isn't based on necessarily polling data, but I would love for you to work it in for the next American values question, is the reason Trump spent $100 million on the anti-trans issue. And because he kept repeating this issue that your child can go to school and their sex would be changed, which is just bonkers, nuts, crazy, has never happened in the history of the United States or frankly anywhere. The reason, again, why this resonates is that it plays into this. These people are the devil. They're going to do something bad to your child. And there's nothing more visceral for a parent than they're going to do something terrible to your child, or they're going to fundamentally change him in a way or her in a way that completely alienates you from your child. Is that part of this good versus evil, make them the devil, someone who would take your child away from you and change their gender has to be eliminated no matter what the cost? Is that part of this same circle?
Absolutely. And then the other one I would throw in that same thing is, this idea that Democrats are for killing babies after they're born. Right. I mean, again, something that is illegal in every jurisdiction in the country, doesn't happen, right? And yet got repeated over and over and over again by Trump and Vance and others on the campaign trail. And again, I think it is about like saying, oh, well, anybody who would do that, who would be for that, is literally beyond the pale, right? They're not people you can have rational conversations with. They're not people you can compromise with. And they just are people who must be eliminated, right? At the end of the day. So it sets up political violence. It sets up all kinds of extremism. And it just fundamentally erodes, the kind of things we need to think about in a democracy. So, we have to be able to think about our fellow citizens just as fellow citizens, right? Who we have very, very strong disagreements with, but at the end of the day, if we lose a debate, we'll live to fight another day, right? And by fight, I mean, like, we'll live to argue and persuade and organize and all the kinds of things you can do in a democracy another day. But when you frame it like this, that, oh, your child could go to school and come home, like, and again, if we take this seriously, what they're saying is like, could come home being mutilated, being surgically mutilated, right? That's what they're talking. That's what they're trying to evoke with that language, not just like a pronoun, but like physically be mutilated. A baby could be born and then actively killed, right? These are things to kind of again, evoke a kind of politics of just disgust, right? And dehumanizes the other side. So I think this is all a part of making it not really even about politics at all, right? It really is something beyond politics. It takes it into this world of extremism where everything is a fight between good and evil to the death.
What do we do about this? I used to think, oh, well, the mainstream media is not doing a good enough job. And then I found out that 70+% of people who read mainstream media actually don't vote for him. So the mainstream media has its problems. I work in mainstream media, but that doesn't seem to be the problem. How do you either break through the information or relate to these people in a way that they begin to treat their fellow Americans in a more humane, human way and begin to exercise some critical, rational thinking? I mean, this is really kind of, is democracy going to work or not? How do we begin to repair this, address this?
Yeah. Well, I think that is the question. I don't have any kind of, well, if I did, we could all just go home if I had any great silver bullet answers for this. But
That's why you on the
um,
show. You're supposed to tell us how
yeah,
to
right.
fix this.
But here's what I'll say: a couple of things. My last book, I talked a lot about this problems that we're talking about. It's the hidden roots of white supremacy. That part of the title talked about all the problems that we're dealing with, and we should remember, right, that part of what we're being asked to reckon with today has been a centuries long struggle. So this is not new. It didn't just kind of pop up yesterday. And in many ways, our kind of forebears kicked this can down the road in various ways, right? And so we are still wrestling with this. I mean, even the fundamental ideas: who's this country for, right? Is it promised land for European Christians? Like that was a very viable and strongly supported view, right? And still is in many quarters, as we were seeing. Or are we a pluralistic democracy where everybody stands on equal footing, regardless of race or religion? Like that's a different thing. And I think here's the thing to me that is why this is so hard now is that in every previous generation until this one, white Christians were enough of the majority of the country that they could pay some lip service to the high principles of pluralism and democracy, knowing that they still had enough numbers to control the board, right? But today, white Christians make up only 41% of the public. And so the question is actually, this is where the rubber meets the road. Did you really mean it when you said you supported a pluralistic democracy? When you are now not in a position just by sheer numbers to control everything. And we're getting a very muddled answer to that question. So I think it's hard what we're doing right now. And other generations have not really had to deal with it. And I think white Christians in particular are having a very hard time coming to terms with reconciling what they've always paid lip service to, pluralism, democracy, right, all of that. But let me just digress real quick. And let's remember, though, that white Christians were making those claims to support pluralism, democracy, while they were supporting Jim Crow in the South.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so these contradictions have always been with us, and we're just being asked, I think, finally, and they're being brought to light in ways that the evasion isn't working anymore. And we're really being asked, do we really support it or not? Where I found some hope, it's actually the second part of the title of the book. So it was The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and The Path to a Shared American Future. And I still think where I found some hope is actually on the ground in local communities. So I spent some time in Mississippi and in Oklahoma, two places that are, these are not liberal bastions, right? And also in Minnesota, also up north. And what I found is that in each of these places, where I really found hope is in groups of people working across lines of race, working across lines of party, but they're trying to solve local problems, and they were taking on difficult things, like they were taking on the Tulsa race massacre, and how do we tell the truth about that, and how do we make some repair? And they were talking about the death of Emmett Till. How do we tell the truth about what happened here? And how do we try to get to the point of making some kind of works of repair? There in Duluth, there was a lynching of the 10,000 white Duluthians turned out to witness in 1920. And that got buried. How do we tell the truth about that? And then try to find some ways to repair the damage. And I think at the local level, there actually are some places like working in very unusual places and working against the prevailing winds in some ways and really making some headway there. The one in Mississippi, for example, which started with a dozen people in a courthouse basement, has now resulted in a new national park. That's the Emmett and Mamie Till Mobley National Park that'll be in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, that's in the progress of being created. And that started from people with no funding, very little education, very rural, very poor place in Mississippi, but deciding, you know what, we're going to tell the truth and we're going to try to do our best to repair the damage that's been done here.
Because we're so focused on national media, even though we're now fragmented into these little silos, people look for a national solution. In other words, isn't there something we can do? Yeah. Isn't there some new media formula? Isn't there some kind of message that will get through? And what I'm hearing from you is that there's really not a lot of things that can substitute for person to person, church to synagogue, town by town. You got to do the work, is what I'm hearing you say. That it's only when your neighbor becomes real and not just a thing that you can begin to see him like a human
Yeah.
being and start resolving some of these issues.
I think that's right. I mean, there are certainly things that, the federal government can do. There's certainly some things that state level governments can do and local governments. I don't want to kind of say there's not. There certainly are.
Sure.
But I think you're right that, and this goes to the issue you raised about why the attacks on transgender, people in this election. I mean, you're right. That became the focus, right? Of if it wasn't immigration, it was attacking transgender people in the election. And I think the part of the reason for that, why was that successful, and why did you hear nothing in this election about marriage equality?
Yeah.
Right. Again, go back to 2004. Oh my God, like you couldn't hear the word abortion without hearing about same-sex marriage. Right. These things seem to be tied,
Right.
inevitably together. Why did Republicans drop that? Right. And I think it's because enough gay people came out. Right.
Right.
And people came to, oh, wait, my neighbor who all of a sudden I didn't know is gay, or my coworker is lesbian, right? And now that changes it because I'm friends with them, right? I know them, I know their kids, right? Those kinds of things. And the real challenge is that there just aren't that many transgender people in the country.
Yes.
And so when we've asked about that, we find, for example, only about 1 in 5 Americans say they know someone who's transgender. And so what I think these very cynical attacks can rely on is the fact that it's very abstract for people, and they can paint a picture that isn't tied to any reality in people's lives, right? And we find, just as we did with marriage equality, people who know someone transgender, no matter what their political persuasion is, no matter what their religious persuasion is, are much more supportive of transgender rights than people who don't know someone. And so there's a real cynicism here, kind of playing on the fact that people don't know people, and then filling that lack of knowledge with these caricatures, right, and kind of awful assertions about transgender people, and them being a threat, and just playing on fear and ignorance. And I think that's why it's been largely successful, and is a challenging thing for us all to kind of wrestle with.
And when you think about it, it's the same with illegal immigrants. There are very few illegal immigrants in many of these states that are so tied up in a ball. We're not talking necessarily about Texas or California or Arizona. They have a real issue there. But why is North Dakota, or why is Montana, or why is a country that literally has no illegal immigration problem, why are they so wound up about it? Well, it's really easy to demonize something that is not real. That's just an abstract threat. That's a bogeyman.
Yeah, you play some B-roll of some brown people, and you talk about
caravans,
the borders being porous, and
people getting murdered.
And you used words like invasion. Right?
Yes,
that's the other thing. We're being invaded. I mean, that was literally the language, that the U.S. is under attack and we're being invaded, as if it's some kind of brown army pouring across the border we're not responding to.
Let me shift gears a little bit. We're about to face an administration that I think is fair to say is not going to be like any other administration. And there may be a whole lot of people who are harmed. There may be a whole lot of people who are deported. There may be a whole lot of people who suffer all kinds of ill effects from this administration. Is there somewhere in the Christian community a sense of obligation and of responsibility to help such people? In other words, where's the Christian sanctuary that used to take people into churches? Where is the tend to the poor and the sick? Is there enough of that left in Christian communities that can kind of push back against the overt politicization and power focus of so much of what we see now coming from so-called Christian leaders?
Well, I mean, again, it's a great question, and we could, go back and throughout American history and ask, a similar question, like, when we were seriously debating slavery versus abolition, right? You could ask a very
Yes.
similar, like, where
Yes.
where are they? And they showed up, right? I mean, there was an abolitionist movement, there. What's just a quick sidebar on that? I mean, what's remarkable about that is that, if you go back and you read many of the sermons and debates, it was the enslaver side of that debate that actually thought they had the better biblical
Right.
theological case, to be made in those debates. But there are places standing up, and I've probably, for example, been in probably 200 churches that have invited me to come talk about this problem, the threat of Christian nationalism, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the anti-gay sentiment, and trying to kind of stand up a version of Christianity and say, like, yeah, that's not us, and that's not how we understand are called as Christians to be in the world. So there is that happening, and it's happening more in the non-evangelical world. What's happened really in the white evangelical world, and again, these are my people, right? This is from whence I come. Like, I grew
Yep.
up as a Southern Baptist, as you know, in Mississippi. Went to a Southern Baptist seminary. I mean, so these are my people. But there has been a real purge that has happened
Yeah.
over the last 10 years. So, in 2016, there were far more dissenting voices, even inside white evangelical circles, than there were in 2020, and then there were in 2024. So think about Beth Moore, Russell
Yes.
Moore, who are not related, David French, people who were clearly inside those worlds and have now all been pushed out.
Yep.
Right. And so that's part of the challenge in the white evangelical world, is as it has shrunk, and it is shrinking, by the way. It's only 13, 14% of the population, but as it shrunk, it's become more homogeneous and more extreme. And so that's kind of part of what we're seeing there. So there's less of this world happening. There are some very minority movements in the evangelical world, the new evangelicals and others doing that work. There's more of it happening in the non-evangelical Protestant world and in the Catholic space, but in the Catholic space, it's happening outside the hierarchy. Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. But the Episcopal Church, the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, others are standing up explicitly anti-Christian nationalism initiatives, and one that actually from the Baptist Joint Committee is actually called Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
Wow.
Right. That's being stood up as well. So there are these things, but again, the thing to remember is that they are in the 1/3
Yeah.
side of white Christianity, not on the 2/3. So they're very much kind of outnumbered, essentially 2-1 among white Christian groups.
Well, that's not a overly cheery outlook. Let me finish with two questions. First of all, will this problem abate over time? They are shrinking. They are diminishing. And when you look at the nuns, that is the none of the aboves, when people respond to religious affiliation, that number continues to rise. So will this problem go away, frankly, as they shrink? Are we in a race for our democracy and our, soul against demography?
I think yes and yes.
Yes.
Is the answer.
Yes.
To that. So on the one hand, the trends are very clear. So again, if we just go back 20 years, when we were in the 2008 election, the country, when Barack Obama was first running for president, was 54% white and Christian. In this past election cycle, it's 41% white and Christian. That's a big shift, just over the last 20 years or so. So it's worth noting that. However, one of the things that I think we often forget is that white Christians turn out to vote at higher rates than other Americans, relative to other Americans. And so what it means is that, for example, that group of white evangelical Protestants, it's only, say, 14% at most of the general population. Looking at the exit polls, it looked like they were almost 1 in 5 voters.
Wow.
Right. So they're overrepresented by about 5 percentage points in the electorate. One way of putting that is that because of that differential turnout, the ballot box essentially acts like a little bit like a time machine, and it takes us back about 10 years. So the electorate looks like about the country did 10 years ago. And so there's a lag effect, right, that we're not fully experiencing the demography that we're actually living in at the ballot box because of these differential turnout rates. So it's going to take a little bit for that to catch up with us. Some of that's turnout, most of that's turnout, but also it means every 4 years there will be fewer, right, of them, because these trends do not look like they are leveling off. They look like they are continuing unabated, at least for now. So I think there's that, but like I said, the kind of delay to just get to where the demographics of the ballot box look like the demographics we're living in will be another 10 years. So what's going to happen between now and the next 10 years? I don't think any of us, with Trump going back to the White House, think that, we can just wait this out and that we'll have much left, in terms of our democracy. Like, we're going to have to kind of meet the moment, I think, with some real outspoken resistance, in these next few years. And I do think it is going to put particularly white Christians who are in that minority on the spot. And I think many, white folks are kind of used to being pretty comfortable, right? Yep. To demonstrate, to protest. These are not things that are in the DNA of most white Christians. They've been pretty comfortably part of the majority. And I think that's going to be sort of a new thing that many white Christians are going to have to learn, right? If they're going to really stand up for, what they really, believe their faith is calling them to do at this moment.
Fascinating. So what's next for you? Is there a book? Is there a project you're working on? What's the next thing for Robbie Jones?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm leaning in. I haven't really committed to a new book project, but I am looking at places like Mississippi, actually. As like, where are we? Is Mississippi have some lessons for our future? It certainly has some places in our past. So I think we'll certainly be doing some more writing and thinking there, but and not just like everything is going wrong in Mississippi. There's certainly enough of that to write about. But where are things going right? Like this, the kind of commemoration of Emmett Till, and his life going on in Mississippi, the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, that is the only state-funded civil rights museum in the country, by the way, and is a pretty hard-hitting. It really tells the truth. It doesn't kind of hide the truth there. The changing of the Confederate flag in Mississippi. There are these things that are happening there, and what might that mean for where we're going, and particularly in the moment, a kind of more hopeful thing, even in a place like Mississippi. How might we find some kind of hope going forward?
Well, it's interesting that you and I may be coming from very different orientations, but I too am looking to the country. Let's see what's going on in the country. Yep. Let's see what's working. Let's sing what's not working. Let's sing what real people are doing. And I think we tend to be so Washington focused, so political focused, that we treat the rest of the country as an afterthought. And maybe in reversing that a bit, we can make a little bit more headway with our fellow American citizens and make some progress to fulfill the country's, I think, ideal, which still holds promise after all is said and done. Thank you so much, Robbie, for coming on the show. You don't exactly provide comfort, but you do provide clarity. And I think right now clarity is important. And frankly, comfort can be overrated. I think it's only when people are a little less comfortable and a little clearer about what the problem is that we can start working on some of these issues. So thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for all the work you do. As listeners of this program and readers of my columns know, I am somewhat Robbie Jones obsessed and will often turn to you for guidance and influence, even when I don't expect it. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jen. The only thing I'm thinking is, like, maybe let's find some comfort in what we do and the work that we do over the next 4 years.
Amen. And that was Robbie Jones. He is always so fascinating and so thought-provoking. Let's see if I can boil down what I took from that. First, we are faced with a phenomenon that is not new to this election, not new to this decade, not new to this century. The problem of white Christian dominance and what they will do to defend it is as old as this country. And because we have never dealt with it, we are always dealing with it. And now it has taken a particularly malicious turn in the hands of a demagogue and a fascist. Second point that I take from this, and that is that there is perhaps a core of America in this reduced, homogeneous, more determined, more insular, white evangelical Christian society that is probably not reachable. But that leaves an awful lot of other people. And it's not just people who read the New York Times and Washington Post, and it's not just people who live in big cities. And I think we have to begin to work really hard on knitting together a truly bipartisan, biracial, multi-generational movement to really fulfill the American dream, to put at our center decency, respect, kindness, some fundamental features that we have taken for granted in American life, but without which democracy simply will not function. And the last thing is we have to find not only a message, but a way to get the message in. And as mainstream media fragments and, frankly, shies away from conflict, I will be looking, and I'll take you on the journey for other ways, other messages, other avenues that are getting through. Some of that is non-profit media, some of that is college media, some of that is local media. There are lots of people doing some interesting things. And if we tag along, we might find out much more about our fellow Americans. So if you enjoyed the program, please tell your friends. They can find us and subscribe wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.